Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, February 28, 2025. I'm your host, Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. This week on Rabble Radio, we're sharing a clip from our February Off the Hill political panel. In this panel, our guests, including community organizer and political commentator Jennifer Arp, writer and policy researcher Chuka Ejeckam, political advocacy and communications professional Sabrina Grover, and Rabble's own parliamentary reporter Karl Nerenberg discussed the ongoing high-stakes Liberal leadership race. Here is a small clip from that panel. Take a listen.
Well, welcome to everybody to today's panel discussion on the Liberal leadership race in Canada. Well, leadership transitions are pivotal moments in any political party's history, and the Liberal Party is no exception. In this critical time, with so much at stake, the leadership race is drawing attention across the country. Today, we will explore the players vying for the top spot, the issues shaping the race, and the impact of the outcome, both on the Liberal Party and the broader political landscape. Joining us for our conversation tonight are community organizer and political commentator Jennifer Arp. Hello, Jennifer. Writer and policy researcher, a regular on our panel, Chuka Ejeckam. Hello, Chuka. Political advocacy and communications professional Sabrina Grover, and Rabble's own senior parliamentary reporter, also a regular, Karl Nerenberg. So welcome to all of you. We also welcome our audience joining us on Zoom tonight, and we hope that you will participate in the chat and be sure to select the option that says to everyone when sharing your thoughts in the chat. And we encourage you to ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we'll certainly do our best, as always, to add your questions. Now, let's get started for tonight. Well, the twists and turns of any leadership race are fascinating to watch unfold, and the Liberal leadership race, of course, is no exception, especially in the extraordinary times that we're in right now with an unfolding trade war with the US and the closure, or prorogation as it's called, of Canada's parliament. We have lots of questions to get into with our panelists. But first off, just some basics for context. I'm going to turn to Karl first because he's so good at knowing parliamentary history and how it all works. And Karl, lead us through just briefly the scenario of having a new leader of the Liberal Party to be chosen March the 9th, who may not be an existing elected member of Parliament. Can a new leader in those circumstances still act as the Prime Minister?
The short answer is yes. It may sound strange, but there's nothing in our constitutional history or practice that says that the Prime Minister actually has to be a member of Parliament. In fact, in 1925, William Lyon Mackenzie King was the Prime Minister at the time. He had an election, he lost his seat, and he remained Prime Minister. It took a while until somebody resigned and he ran in a by-election, but for that whole period, interim period, he remained Prime Minister. Again, in 1945, exactly the same thing happened. So that's quite awesome.
Okay, good. So that just clears that up as a matter of information. Now, I know that you've been itching to also weigh in on what a new Liberal leader will face. So I'm just going to quickly follow up with that with you, Karl. We are living in extraordinary times. So what is it that you are hoping that the new Liberal leader will do, whoever he or she may be?
So we are, and I appreciate making allusion to a trade war. I'd say we're not just in a trade war here. We're in a battle for the survival of our country. Donald Trump is waging economic war against us, and it's getting bloody close to the other kind. And since the survival of our country is at stake, I'm going to pick up an idea from Craig Scott, a former colleague of yours, Libby, who said it's time for a national unity government. It's time for the government that Winston Churchill put together in Britain of multi-parties when he became Prime Minister during World War II. Somehow, The last thing we need after, and I presume it'll be Mark Carney, becomes Prime Minister, is a quick election. Much as there's politically that might seem tempting, the last thing anybody needs. What we need is a series of robust policies and a united front as much as we can. You may not get Pierre Poilievre to join it, but he may not make too much trouble. And I just think we just have to put partisan politics aside to the extent we can and say that our country really is at stake. It really is. And the government to the south of our border is not just angry about trade. It is a fascist government. They're investigating opposition members elected to the Senate. They are beyond rationality. They are a dangerous, potentially violent fascist government that lies every day. And we are just really have to get ourselves united and say, he wants to take us over. He is not kidding. And nobody's going to help us but ourselves.
Okay. Now, Karl, we'll definitely be coming back to this. So thank you for kind of putting that on the table. And I'm going to turn it over to Robin now.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue for a question to you, Sabrina. Welcome to the panel. You ran as a Liberal candidate in Calgary in 2021. So we're very interested to get your take on the Liberal leadership race. How do you see it shaping up with just a little more than 2 weeks to go?
Yeah, thanks so much, Robin. I think that the race has been extremely interesting for only having been a race for about 5 weeks, right? Normally, I think we're used to leadership races taking upwards of 3 to 6 months, and we've only had this race on the docket since the end of January, really, when the Prime Minister resigned. And what you've seen from the race is a fundamental shift in the Canadian voting public. We've not only seen kind of the momentum gather around, I would say, predominantly 3 candidates, although there are 5 candidates in the race. We've also seen a significant shift in voting intention from a general standpoint. So the lead between the Liberals and the Conservatives has decreased significantly. You're not seeing a 20-point lead like we were, December 2024. And so I think that is probably the most exciting part of this race. And I think that this idea that you've got candidates out there raising significant dollars, more dollars than I think the party has really been able to bring in even over the last year. In a mere 6 weeks, you're really seeing momentum pick up. There were about 400,000 registered Liberals that have declared their interest in voting in the race. But now as we head into kind of that voter ID and voter activation period, that's when I think we might see that narrow down a little bit and narrow down a little bit from 400,000. But overall, I think the momentum of having even 400,000 people register in less than 3 weeks is pretty exciting. So from my standpoint, I just think that the momentum that the party's seeing today is unparalleled.
Okay. Thanks, Jennifer. It's hard to believe that here we are talking about the Liberal leadership race almost having ended. And, we almost have forgotten that a Prime Minister resigned. What was that, barely a month ago? And here we are, move on. So actually, just to follow up with Jennifer now, I think it would be very interesting for you to share with us what you think the challenges will be for the new Liberal leader. Not the least of which is that there could be a non-confidence vote if Parliament actually does come back. Of course, there's now more and more speculation that a new leader could go straight to an election. We've got trade wars going on, all the issues in the South that I think Karl laid out so well. So how do you see it in terms of what these challenges will be for the new leader of the Liberal Party?
Well, thank you so much, Libby, for the question. I really think as much as the shortness of this leadership race has been interesting, I also think it's going to be a challenge for the new leader. With a longer drawn out leadership race, you have the opportunity to really engage the party membership, to engage especially that youth vote and some of those pieces that are really critical to organizing heading into an election. And I think, seeing this leadership race happen in such a short period of time and also in the winter will mean that one of the challenges facing the new leader is really going back to the party membership and say, now I need you to step up. and I need you to get on board, and let's come together, and we need to beat Polyev, and there's really significant issues that our country is facing, and a liberal government needs to be able to carry the torch and take it forward. I also think that telling their story and why they're different than Trudeau, and why they're different than this government, and what their policies are going to be that are different than the current government is going to be a challenge. We've seen that shift in the polls start to happen, but there is only one poll that matters, and that is election day. And once we head into election period, what voters will start to be thinking about will be different and more different than just the United States, right? Affordability is going to be an issue. And everything that we're facing right now is going to be an issue, and the amount of money that the government is spending, all of those things are going to be an issue. So will we see a shift in the polls following the leadership race? Potentially. As well, when you look at the nuts and bolts of what goes on in party organizing and behind the scenes, there's been a lot of resignations, a lot of MPs, a lot of cabinet ministers that have said they're not running again. That's going to be a challenge for the new leader, identifying the right team and putting the people around them that they're going to need to go into an election, if we're headed into an election. And if we're not headed into an election, then to make sure that we've got the right cabinet ministers in portfolios to be able to do the hard work that's going to need to be done. Election timing, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, but election timing is going to be another challenge. If we're heading, ending a leadership race and heading into enforced tariffs, that could impact when an election is called. And so all of those pieces, I think, really for a new leader, there's an immense challenge and an uphill ahead. So hopefully we can, the Liberals can take some of that momentum and carry it forward.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
All right. Actually, that's a good segue to bring Chuka in. Chuka, anybody who's listened to Off the Hill knows that you've always been a skeptic of the political agenda of powerful elites. So many Canadians are feeling like a lot of anxiety right now about what's happening under the Trump administration. So is our Canadian democracy, and maybe as Karl said, even our country, as imperfect as it is, at risk?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the Conservative Party is quite so venal as the Republicans, but I do think that the fundamental problem does exist here as well. The fundamental problem being corporations have amassed more power than governments. In the United States, of course, it's a very sort of almost comically overt expression of this, in that there's one guy who's literally walking into government agencies and shutting them down. But the fact that corporations have an immense amount of influence over our lives, including on issues of climate change, on issues of sort of environmental preservation, things like that, and then of course the immense amount of influence they have in the labor market. I think that fundamental problem exists, and while it might not be as practicable in Canada to kind of just shut down agencies the way it's happening in the US, I think that sort of politics, where corporations are more forcefully exerting power over governments, I mean, they are watching one another pursue this, and they're taking notes. I think it's certainly not difficult to imagine a mining company or an association of mining companies being more forceful in their engagement in Canadian politics.
Yeah, and just go ahead, Robin.
No, great point. Actually, I'm just curious as a follow-up, because I'm wondering if you think that the corporations here in Canada could take advantage of this kind of what's going on in the U.S., because it's so blatant. You're right, to kind of to push that message of look how bad it is down there when up here it's great. And also, and related to that, like I've noticed that like in a lot of pop culture, there's kind of like dystopian stuff. There's like the common enemy, right? Whether it's the zombies or whatever, and the same thing could happen here, where a similar thing where you point to the U.S. and say, "Hey, look how bad it is, but we're good." Like, you think that could become a dynamic?
I mean, I do think that probably still has like cultural relevance. I imagine like sort of colloquial Canadian political culture will lean into that quite a bit. But in terms of a common enemy, in regard to corporations and profiteers and whatnot. I think it's more. I would say that it's more likely that they will exploit fears about the trade war, the circumstances that Karl discussed. I think it's more likely that they would exploit fears about that in attempt to get concessions from the government to sort of to argue that the government has to rely on these corporations to maintain good relations with the United States, in that they aren't because the government won't be able to maintain them themselves. I would say that it's more likely the corporations will do that, exploit the situation to benefit themselves.
Mm-hmm. It does feel like there's a kind of a three-level chess game going on, both in Canada and the US, not only around trade, but how it's impacting Canadian politics. So I just want to come back to Karl and bring you back in. And just to put the facts on the table, Parliament has been prorogued, shut down, based on the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, going to the Governor General until March 24th. Liberal leadership race, March 9th, new leader. Calls from opposition parties to urgently recall Parliament to deal with the trade issues, while at the same time saying that they want to bring a non-confidence vote to make, to have the government fall, which seems somewhat contradictory, but there it is. So I guess the question I want to put to you, Karl, to sort of expand on what you were saying earlier, with this very complex situation unfolding before us, how likely is a recall of Parliament, noting that the last Parliament was utterly dysfunctional. I mean, they couldn't get any legislation through. Could a new leader even conceivably extend prorogation? There would be political consequences to that. I know that your view is that you would like to see the new leader make some kind of deal to keep things going. But realistically, what are the risks of each of these outcomes? Oh, you're on mute.
Trying to be well behaved and not interrupt, so I put myself on mute. So there are many risks to anything. If Mark Carney does win, and when I talk to Liberals, they fully expect that to happen, unless there's something huge happening that we're not perceiving, then he would not. The transition period between him and Trudeau would actually take about 2 weeks. It wouldn't happen from one day to the next. It would take technically a little time before he actually would become Prime Minister. So he would likely be becoming Prime Minister just around the time when Parliament's supposed to come back. So he's already telegraphed, Carney, he's not telegraphing much about what he believes in or what he wants to do, but he telegraphed that he could call an election. So if he bothers to say it, since he says so little, he really means it. So if he's listening, I'm saying, don't try for another solution. It's too risky to call election. From a crass political point of view, it's too risky for Carney to call election, because he's very, very inexperienced politician. Read today, the National Post hates him anyway, but they got him dead to rights in today's National Post, saying two different things in English and in French, and saying two different things in the same interview in French, and his French wasn't so good, so maybe he didn't know what he was saying. He didn't mean to say something different from what he said in the earlier part of the interview, which it means, way back, I'm old to remember when John Turner came back in politics. He was very experienced, but he was very rusty. He'd been out of politics a long time, and he made a lot of gaffes and said a lot of dumb things and got himself into a lot of trouble. I think he should govern, and I think I would hope that at least the NDP would see it that way, that, you people, I'm not a political professional for any party, so the people here who have lifelong and intense associations with the Liberal Party are seeing this as liberals and as political partisans. I'm looking at this as a Canadian, as a 77-year-old Canadian who was born barely after World War II, who has seen a goddamn awful lot, and I've never seen this. I've seen the action of American imperialism in Vietnam, in the Congo, in Chile, all over the world, but they usually kind of left us alone. Now we're facing a different kind of world. Putin and Trump are carving up the world. Trump gaslights Ukraine. Ukraine tells them they started the war when we all know the Russians invaded them. He runs around telling lies about Canada, which nobody in the United States refutes. We're subsidizing Canada to the tune of $200 billion a year, which is a meaningless thing. means nothing. And he really means it when he wants to take over Greenland and then Canada. He is hell-bent on glory. He's hell-bent on being the great emperor of North America in a new world based on the 1890s. He says that as well, of spheres of influence. We need a government. We need people, all the politicians and the political activists and the political professionals, to rise above their partisan stripe. We're not going to get it from Poilievre, but at least we should get it from the NDP and the Liberals, and maybe even from the Bloc, and focus on Canada now, not on their political advantage.
Okay, thanks, Karl.
Yes, thank you. All right. Actually, this question we want to actually throw it to all the panelists, but we'll let's give the question, then we'll see what we're going to start with. But in his recent podcast interview with Jordan Peterson, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre criticized wokeism and urged society to, quote, put aside this obsession with race. He also argued wokeism invented race and that race was imported to Canada from the US. So do you think these messages will resonate with many Canadians? So let's start with Chuka, and anybody else who wants to jump in afterwards, go ahead.
I mean, I would say that the people who would be convinced by those arguments are already convinced by those arguments. I don't think that they convince people. I think people who hold those beliefs already respond to them. I think, I don't think that, I don't know that Poilievre is like a committed fascist. I don't think he believes in anything enough to be a committed fascist. And if he is a white supremacist, I imagine it to be largely in the sort of passive way that people become white supremacists.
That was community organizer and political commentator Jennifer Arp, writer and policy researcher Chuka Ejeckam, political advocacy and communications professional Sabrina Grover, and Rabble's parliamentary reporter Karl Nerenberg in our February 19th panel, Off the Hill, examining the Liberal leadership race. To watch the full panel, check out Rabble TV or Rabble's YouTube channel. And now this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. Here to bring us up to date is Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting this week in provincial news. Yesterday, Ontario voters went to the polls. On Friday, after most of the votes have been counted, we can say that Progressive Conservative Doug Ford has won another majority. Similar to the last provincial election, voter turnout was low, with only 45% of all Ontarians actually voting. The Ontario NDP once again will serve as the official opposition. The Ontario Liberal Party managed to regain their official party status in the legislature with 14 seats, but leader Bonnie Crombie did not win her seat in Mississauga, making her the only major party leader who failed to win her race. Key issues in this campaign were the tariff threat from U.S. President Donald Trump. A 25% tariff on all Canadian goods is scheduled to go into effect on March 4th. Tariffs were not the only issue, however. There are 2.5 million Ontario residents who don't have a family doctor. Emergency rooms in Ontario were closed for more than 14,000 hours in 2024. Education is another key issue. Post-secondary institutions are particularly struggling right now, with some colleges cutting as much as 40% of all of their curriculum due to budget constraints. All of these issues will now be in the hands of a new legislature in Queen's Park. In national news, Rabble columnist Aaron Blondo writes about the threat Donald Trump poses to Canada and the response we will need in order to face that threat. There has been a surge of nationalism in the wake of Trump's threats to place tariffs on Canadian goods, and his frequent comments that Canada should become the 51st state of the U.S. Blondo argues that rather than focusing on nationalism, Canada should focus on climate solutions. Addressing the climate crisis and moving away from fossil fuels will not only strengthen Canada's economy and national security, it will make life better for all. In Quebec news, a coalition of nonprofit organizations serving vulnerable populations and other progressive causes organized a protest this week in Montreal, warning of the dangers that a Pierre Poilievre government would pose to the groups that they represent. The coalition, which named itself Courage, held their protest outside of the Montreal Metro station in the city's Mount Royal neighborhood on Thursday, February 27th. The groups represent immigrants, the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, Muslims, unionized workers, and many others. All are concerned that federal government, led by Pierre Poilievre, would be dangerous to their members. Also this week, Rabble columnist PK Much gives us a lesson on rotating credit and savings associations, also known as ROSCAs. ROSCAs function like banks, but are more diverse and democratic. They can be formed by groups of individuals where each agrees to pay a set amount to the ROSCA annually. Each ROSCA member is also allowed to withdraw a certain amount of money from the investment every year. This allows members to access funds without the burden of going through the traditional banking system. Andrea Barrett is a ROSCA network director and wellness speaker, and said that with the rising uncertainty caused by the election of Donald Trump in the U.S., community cooperation is more important than ever, saying, quote, "As it becomes more difficult to make ends meet, working together to help each building mutual aid networks and systems run by the people for the people are back in vogue." End quote. And finally, the Alberta government continues to be mired in controversy after the firing of Alberta Health Services CEO Athana Mentzelopoulos earlier this year. After being fired as CEO, Mentzelopoulos filed a lawsuit against the province, claiming she was dismissed for investigating corrupt practices when it came to awarding contracts. Late last week, it was revealed that the Alberta Health Services Board had advised Mentzelopoulos to go to the RCMP with her concerns prior to her dismissal. Mentzelopoulos was fired by Alberta Health Minister Adriana LaGrange on January 8th, and at that same time, LaGrange also dismissed the entire Alberta Health Services Board. Earlier this week, Infrastructure Minister Peter Guthrie resigned from his position after calling for LaGrange to step down until an investigation could be completed. As always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Karl Nerenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.